Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session on investor action on deforestation, lessons from Brazil. My name is Tom Barron. I'm a manager within the stewardship team at the PRI, where I help to work on a lot of our issues in relation to stewardship more broadly, but also help to coordinate our collaborative engagement between investors and companies on issues of deforestation. So it's a pleasure to be moderating this session on what I think is such an important topic, and I'm sure you'll all agree. Before we get started and before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to quickly give an overview of some of PRI's work in this area and also some of the general trends that we are seeing amongst the institutional investor community and our signatory base. So I suppose the first thing is that this is something that has been going on for quite a long time at the PRI. So since 2012, we have been coordinating the investor working group on sustainable palm oil. This is made up of over 60 investors with approximately $10 trillion in assets under management, who are engaging with companies across the supply chain to promote a more sustainable industry. More recently, our work on deforestation has focused on the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forests, which is another collaborative engagement that we are coordinating with the organization Series in the US, so I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, which obviously focuses on cattle and soybean supply chains and therefore focuses primarily on Latin America and Brazil. And I suppose what we are generally seeing as a trend is that there is an increased interest amongst institutional investors on deforestation, not only as a risk to individual investee companies, but also as a systemic risk to their portfolios. I think we see a lot of investors looking at deforestation through the climate change lens, with deforestation estimated to contribute to between 10 and 15% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. I think we also see interest from investors on deforestation because of the links that soft commodity production and deforestation has to labor rights issues, as well as indigenous rights and issues related to those. And I think most recently, really what we are seeing is a huge interest from investors on deforestation as a way to address the unprecedented loss of biodiversity, which obviously, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a huge issue for investors and the society, I suppose, as in general. And I suppose in looking at these risks and more broadly at the industry, we're also seeing a lot of government action around this area. So, for example, in the UK and also in the EU, they're looking at introducing due diligence requirements on large companies for imported deforestation related to forest risk commodities. We're also seeing the historic focus of NGOs on corporates and their role in addressing deforestation shifting to financial institutions. And I think it's also important to add that it's not just NGOs anymore. We're also seeing, for example, last year, US Congress or a number of members of Congress in the US sent a letter to large US asset managers and also other financial institutions asking what they are doing to address deforestation. And so overall, what we are seeing is an increased interest in deforestation from investors, an increased awareness and knowledge of the issue. And I think all of this is leading through to increased activity amongst institutional investors to try to address deforestation and the associated risks that are related to that. And I think this is most clearly emphasized last year in October or September actually, when over 250 investors signed a public statement expressing their concerns over deforestation and particularly fires in the Amazon. And then again, I think also this has been shown earlier this year when we saw approximately 30 investors sign a letter to the Brazilian government expressing their concerns over deforestation risks more generally. So I think in general, we are seeing that this is a trend of increasing interest, and we don't anticipate that this trend will slow down. And I think really in relation to this session on deforestation in Brazil, what we are seeing is obviously that Brazil has historically been an agricultural powerhouse in the production and export of key commodities, particularly cattle and soy. But at the same time, with this production and in this increase in output, we've also seen deforestation linked to cattle and soybean production. But I think it's also very important to emphasize and highlight that historically Brazil has been very successful in reducing deforestation whilst also managing to increase agricultural output of both of these commodities. And that is, I think, in part due to a mix between a very strong regulatory regime when enforced and also a number of voluntary private sector commitments that have been made by companies. So really this hopefully shouldn't be anything new to address this really in terms of it's about enforcing existing policies and regulation, and also for corporates about enforcing existing corporate commitments to address deforestation. And so with that, I think the focus of this session will really be about laying the context and some of the concerning trends in deforestation that we are seeing, as well as highlight what the relevance is to institutional investors, how investors can go about assessing this risks to companies and portfolios, what the number of tools out there available for them to be able to do this. And then I think importantly, and most importantly, what the different tools and points of leverage that investors can use through their stewardship activities to address this risk and address deforestation. And so, yeah, with that, I suppose I'd like to introduce our lineup of speakers. So first we have Emine Isciel, who is Head of Climate and Environment at Storebrand Asset Management. She is really heading up their leading work on this issue. We also have Daniela de Costa-Bulthuis, who is an emerging markets equities portfolio manager with a focus on Brazil and Africa. And then we also have Andrea Guimarães, who is Executive Director of the Environmental Research Institute of the Amazon, otherwise known as EPAM, as well as co-facilitator of Coalizão Brazil, so the Brazil Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture, which is a multi-sector civil society organization made up of the private sector and a number of civil society organizations. So we've got a great lineup, and first to kick things off, we'll have Andre to present an overview of some of the context in Brazil, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion. I'd also like to add also that there is an option for Q&A. So at the end of the discussion, should there be time, we are welcome to Q&A, and there should be a chat box on your right-hand side that will enable you to ask questions. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Andre to provide a bit more of the context and trends of deforestation in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, PRI, for inviting me to talk here. It's really an honor to be here with you, Emine, and Daniela to talk a little bit about deforestation, the Amazon, and challenges ahead. So I would like very much, Tom, to contextualize what's going on in the Amazon. In order to do that, I think we should go back some 50 years when this process started. But just before flying back to the past, let me put a little bit the Amazon into perspective. The Amazon today, it represents about 50% of the tropical forests in the world. It's the storage facility for somewhere between 10 and 15% of all solutions that life has found to inhabit this planet over 3 billion years. So it's a major depository of biodiversity. It recycles water that is fundamental, among other things, for the Brazilian production of food and agriculture in general. It stores the equivalent to 10 years of global human emissions of carbon. So that gives us a little bit of the perspective of the Amazon, the importance of the Amazon. And that's for no other reason that the entire world is concerned about the Amazon. Our scientists here at EPAM and other groups in Brazil would say that there's no way we will reach the targets of the Paris Agreement if the Amazon's integrity is not maintained. So the Amazon is a centerpiece. It's a fundamental piece in the climate change arena. It's a centerpiece in the food production arena, being Brazil responsible to feed 1 to 1.2 billion people every day because we have this free rain coming from the Amazon. So the Amazon, playing with the Amazon is playing with fire, literally. So we are playing with fire now. So given that context, let me roll back the movie 50 years ago. 50 years ago, in the late 60s, early 70s, Brazil was a net importer of food. So we were facing challenges in terms of balance of payments. We were at risk. I mean, the Brazilian population was at risk, was growing very much. We had back then about 1/3 of the population we have today. So we had about 65, 70 million inhabitants. We are now close to 210. So Brazil was smaller, although dependent upon imports of food. And here we are in 2020. Today, Brazil is, as you said, Tom, an agricultural powerhouse. It represents about, the Brazilian production of food is about 7-8% of the total global production of food. Brazil is one of the only 23 countries in the world that produce their own food and enough to export. So that puts us in a very important position when it comes to global food security. And that's a success story, and every single Brazilian is very proud of it. However, there was a price tag, or there was a cost associated with this process. Throughout the past 50 years, we lost 50% of the forest cover, the natural forest cover of the central savannas in Brazil, the so-called Cerrado. So half of the Cerrado is already cleared for cropland, for pasture land, and so on. And also around, a little less, but around 20% of the Amazon were chopped down and burned in this process. Once again, that was the paradigm of the 70s, and I'm not here to blame the history or to blame authorities and scientists that decided upon this trajectory for Brazil. But the fact of the matter is that the way we have developed our agricultural sector in the past 30, 40, 50 years cannot be the same way that we will further develop our agriculture in the coming years. And that goes for a number of reasons. First of all, because we need to sell our products, and without a good reputation, you don't sell anything in this world. So we need to be, to comply with the demands of our clients. So that's one reason. Another reason is that we need to attract capital to invest in our agriculture, and if we don't present ourselves to investors, either national investors or foreign investors, as a reliable country to invest, we are not going to get the investments that we need to go further. But most importantly, what's happening already, and as a member of a scientific institution in Brazil, IPAM, as you said, Tom, I can tell you that the most recent findings of science in the Amazon are pointing in the direction of a collapse in the rain systems in some areas. So we have been observing, for example, actually, let me tell you a little bit about the comparative advantage of Brazil. One of the comparative advantage of Brazil in agricultural terms is the fact that we can have two crops, two harvests in the same year. So there's a lot of rain, well distributed, and for a long time, that allows for Brazil to produce double cropping every year. In some areas in southern Amazon, in northern Cerrado, we have been observing a reduction of 1 week in the rain cycle. That is not yet affecting the harvest, but will soon be affected. Every degree centigrade that we increase in the temperature, we lose about 1 week of rain cycle. So, and between 2000 and 2015, we have already increased the temperature by 1 centigrade. So this temperature continues to increase, and we are losing water cycle. So whether it is for a reputational matter or a practical matter, like rain, for example, to the crops, we need to stop the degradation. We need to stop the deforestation in the Amazon. So stopping the deforestation in the Amazon is a must-do. It should not be, in my opinion, a debate anymore. It's something that we should be talking about how to do and not what to do. What has happened in the past? Let's put it in a longer perspective. In the past 10 years, is that we've been observing a reversion in the process of the deforestation in the Amazon. From 2000 to 2010, 2011, we were able to drop the deforestation in the Amazon by 80%. And during that time, the beef industry has doubled in size and in production, and the grain production has almost tripled its amount produced at the same time. So there's no more argument to defend the idea that we need to continuously expand the frontier to continue to grow. That's not a fact anymore. With technology, with best practices, with better infrastructure, with better seeds and technology in general, we can definitely produce more in the same area that we have cleared already. The Amazon itself has somewhere close to 50 million hectares. That's almost a UK in territory, which is land that is degraded already. So it has been deforested, but it serves no more purposes in terms of production anymore. So the challenges now, and I'll stop in a minute, but my last thought here to share with you, Tom, is this. As I said, we cannot continue doing the way we did in the past. And if we cannot do that because we're going to get hurt, we have to change. In order to change, we have to, one, stop deforestation. That has a cost associated. Enforcement is expensive in such a region. We need to set up and create more protected areas in more indigenous territories, and that has a price tag associated to it. We need to invest in farmers and ranchers that still have the right to deforest by the Brazilian law, and that's a very important point that needs to be clarified here. There are still millions and millions of hectares that can be legally deforested, and we need to deal with that. And the way to deal with that, eventually, payment for environmental services, carbon markets. Here we are. We got some connecting dots there between the opportunities in the climate agenda and the challenges that we have in Brazil. So we need to invest in stopping the deforestation, but we also need to invest in increasing the production. That's the challenge ahead. Of course, Brazil is polarized today. Bolsonaro's government is not helping this debate to happen, to go in the right direction. Unfortunately, the rhetoric of the current administration of Brazil goes backwards. In my opinion, it's like listening to a president from the 60s, and we are not there anymore. We are in a moment in which we need to consolidate a new position in the world. We need to consolidate that position with less deforestation, with increased reputation and more attractiveness to investments, and increasing and letting the deforestation in the Amazon increase as we are facing this year. We are facing most likely an increase of somewhere between 20 to 30% compared to the levels that we have had last year. And last year, remember, we have had already an increase in 20% compared to the previous year. So we are going through a continuous process of increasing deforestation, which needs to stop. But stopping that requires investments. So my last comment, Tom, is this. I would like to leave a suggestion to the audience. Everybody must be asking themselves, what can I do in this scenario? I would suggest three things for folks, for investors, for companies, for the audience in general. One is learn more about what's going on in the Amazon. Most of the deforestation is being caused by a few individuals. So it's important to separate the good from the bad guys. And the bad guys are way less than the good guys. So let's not level on the bottom of the process, because if we do that, we'll be mixing the good and bad guys, and that's not the solution of the problem. Number one. Number two, divest from the bad guys and punish them. That's another suggestion. At the same time, that invest in the good guys, promote the good guys, open markets to the good guys. That's the best way to separate the good from the bad guys and making sure that the future steps of Brazil towards stopping the deforestation in the Amazon will be completed. I think the coalition that you mentioned is a good example, Tom. That's what we are trying to do amongst NGOs, the private sector, banks in Brazil. If the government is not interested, the Brazilian society is very interested and is committed, and we are trying to do what has to be done, which is to stop the deforestation in the Amazon. I'll stop here so that we have some time to chat.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot, Andre. I think you covered a lot there, and obviously crucially, I think, highlighted some of the key impacts that deforestation has in terms of the water cycle, tipping points, and obviously there's health impacts from the fires as well. And obviously these all impact the economy and ultimately investors. So with that, and maybe starting with you, Daniela, it'd be great to hear what Robeco's views are on deforestation and how you see it as a relevant risk to your portfolios.
Okay. Now, Tom, we are pretty much aligned with all that Andre said. We think that deforestation is a systemic risk that is growing. So we see issues as long-term productivity compromise that need to be tackled, droughts across the globe. If you look into all food producing countries, climate change has been impacting not only crops, but also access to water. It's increasing poverty in certain regions. So we think that has economic impacts and investment implications. Our stand is it has to do with accountability. We think that we need to tell our clients how do we stand in the world looking forward, and then our clients demand us to be responsible on that. So we think biodiversity is a way not only to help reducing emissions, but also taking a stand to sustainable development goals. So for us it's very important. And then specifically talking about emerging markets. In emerging markets, you always have the conflict between the development of economies that need to grow in production, that need to curb poverty. But we see that deforestation actually increases poverty, and it's not a solution to poverty. And that's a message that we need to send around, that there is enough data showing that forest protection actually creates economic resilience.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Daniela. And maybe also, Emine, to hear Storebrand's views on deforestation as a risk to your investors or your clients and also your portfolios.
Yeah, I think we're very aligned with what Daniela and Robeco said, and Andres, I will not touch upon the relevance because we see this through the lens of climate change, biodiversity, and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So I'll just make sure that we're aligned on that. But the risk for, I always say for Storebrand, we care about deforestation for two main reasons, and I'll simplify it. It's good for the planet, it's good for business. So when I say it's good for business, we see that investors are increasingly considering climate-related financial risk and opportunities in their investment decisions. In the past, we have focused on the energy sector, but the relevance and the significance of deforestation to climate change is becoming more obvious to investors now. And when we talk about risk, we're talking about reputational risk, regulatory risk, or operational risk. As a European investor based in Norway, we see some really interesting development in this area. So we see that financing forest risk commodities such as cattle, palm oil, soy, or timber is becoming increasingly risky due to the tightening of the regulatory framework. For example, in July this year, we have the EU taxonomy that came into force. I know that Brazil will also eventually get their own taxonomy aligned with the EU taxonomy. It will determine which economic activities are sustainable or not. This means that a company involved in deforestation will not be taxonomy eligible, and we can not make that company part of a fund promoted as sustainable. We see similar trends in the European countries, in the UK, and what we are conscious about here in Storebrand is that these regulatory framework and the limitations, it will limit market access to the companies that we're invested in. And this is a financial risk to us. And then I have to talk about reputational risk, because in Norway, we have very conscious consumers. A few years ago, we had a full boycott of palm oil products. And people living in Norway, they are fully aware. We are a big salmon industry here. They're fully aware that the sushi that they eat in Oslo, in Norway, it's linked to the soy and deforestation in Brazil. So we have a huge reputational risk, and we don't want to be, the issue with palm oil, it had impact on the returns, and we don't want to end up in a similar situation like that. So these are the risks that we are assessing currently when we're investing in companies or divesting from companies.
Great, and you highlighted there at the end, assessing companies on the risks for deforestation. This is something that, as PRI, we've obviously had a number of conversations with investors about, and it is a difficult thing. There is no silver bullet, and it requires, as Andre said, for investors to be aware of what is going on in the Amazon and have knowledge of deforestation. But maybe starting with you, Emine, what is Storebrand's approach to assessing deforestation risks? How do you go about it for individual investee companies?
So this is a very complex question. We have been assessing deforestation risk to our portfolios for almost 10 years now. We started with palm oil, and then we launched a deforestation policy last year and widened the scope of our work to the 4 soft commodities that are the main drivers to deforestation. So we went from just looking at palm oil to also look at cattle, soy, and timber. And little did we know that this was going to be a very complex work, because there are so many tools out there. They have different coverage, different quality, and methodology, and they don't even talk to each other. So this is a very, very challenging task for investors. But what I can say is that different tools will provide you with information and show which investee companies are linked to deforestation. So you can you can use it for active ownership, for investment, or divestment. So going forward so when we did our first deforestation assessment in 2013, the environmental breaches and the human rights breaches were so severe that we divested from the whole palm oil sector at the plantation level. We were just left with one company. So, but for us, the exclusion is the last resort. What we're doing now, we're carrying out a comprehensive deforestation risk assessment here in Storebrand. We will use it to identify which companies to talk with to improve their sustainability practices. And as Andre said in his presentation, we want to also identify the best companies, and we want to allocate more capital to those companies. Our approach has never been divestment, but I also have to say that we don't have much confidence in the meat packers in Brazil right now, and we are currently not invested in any of them. And we have actually divested from, without naming any, we have divested from a couple of them, and you can find them on our website which companies they are. But this is the last resort. But right now we don't have the confidence in them.
Perfect. And Daniela, maybe Robeco's approach as well. I know probably quite similar, and I know that you have also been doing a lot of work on palm oil as well.
Well, if you know, Robeco's history came from the Rabobank, which is an agribusiness bank here in the Netherlands. The first time we looked into the palm oil biodiversity issues was 2007, I think. And then, since then, we have been working on biodiversity. We have a similar approach to Storebrand. I want to highlight, aside from timber, palm oil, and the agribusiness sector, I think infrastructure is also a sector that creates a lot of concern for us. In Brazil, we have some bad examples, unfortunately, of those structurant hydro plants that are very bad for the environment. They generated a lot of volatility in the energy system, impacted the water flows, and also the local community. So we looked into that sector as well. In terms of our approach, what we decided to do is to create an internal task force for biodiversity. And so we will engage with all companies we invest in different segments, in infrastructure, in agribusiness, in timber, palm oil, we also want to engage on a sovereign basis. We think that it's worth in certain countries, it's worth to engage on a sovereign basis. You all know that we have been doing that. And we signed also a financial pledge for biodiversity here in Europe. We want to show results already up to 2024. In terms of divestment, we don't want to divest. I have a slightly different view on the meat packers. I do think they have a lot of challenges, but we think we are trying to engage in a very serious way because we want to be pragmatic in a way that it's very difficult to imagine that the biggest beef exporter in the world will reduce beef production while you only have 5 kilos per capita consumption of beef in China. So what we see is that Chinese consumers, they will increase their consumption of beef. And then the way to change that will be engaging with those companies that they produce on a sustainable way. So in that sense, it worries a lot, the trends. But what we saw in terms of certain companies announcing commitments, we see as a first step. We need to look with a skeptical eye. And then I hear Emine on that because, there was a lot of damage related to those companies. So we need to be pragmatic and looking with a skeptical eye. But we also think that if we don't have any position in those companies, it's going to be difficult for us to make ourselves heard because we want them to hear us and to do something. So we are a bit taking up an activist approach in this particular industry, also considering the context they play on a global exporting scenario.
Great, thank you, Daniela. And I think we can touch on some of those points around corporate engagement and also policy engagement later in the discussion. But I do think what you touched on there is important in that we've seen a lot of companies who have made commitments, either 2020 no deforestation commitments, and have subsequently not been able to meet those, or they almost certainly won't in the next month of the year. And really, this has become, well, as a result of a realization, I think, by companies that these are kind of systemic issues. They need change at the industry level. And while the companies can address it through their supply chain to an extent, they also understand that it requires a lot of different avenues and different methods for them as companies to try and influence change on the ground to what is ultimately a very complex issue with a lot of different actors. So maybe moving the discussion on, Andre, I'd like to kind of go over to you in that, you touched on the role of the government in your opening address in terms of addressing it. And obviously investors have typically looked at the role of companies. But in terms of trying to get investors to address this risk, which has obviously been highlighted by Daniela and Emine as quite a relevant one for investors, there's obviously a lot of different solutions and a lot of different levers that they can use. But to be able to use those, they need to know what the solutions are in the first place to address deforestation. So it'd be great if you could touch on, from some of your points of view, the different policy levers and also private sector actions that are required to bring about a reduction in deforestation rates.
Thanks, Tom, and very interesting points raised by Emine and Daniela. And I have to say that both are legitimate. Storebrand decides not to invest because they're a client. Actually, they're investors. The population of Norway doesn't want to invest in that particular company, and we have to respect that. But honestly, I mean, I have to say, to tell you that doesn't help the problem. And I'll try to exemplify it. You've mentioned the meat packers in Brazil. It's important to put it in perspective. And I'm not here to advocate for any meat packers, for Christ's sake. Please, I'm going to lose my job if they realize I'm doing that. So that's absolutely not what I'm doing. I'm trying just to help us understand the problem here. About 85% of the Brazilian production of meat is consumed domestically. So only 15% is exported, and now it's changing. Most of it used to be exported to Europe, and now it's shifting towards China, and China is increasing very much, and so on, as Daniela pointed. Most, if not all, of the production from Brazil of meat from Brazil that is exported from to Europe do not come from the Amazon. It comes from Cerrado, and most of them come from the south. And for a very technical reason, it's because the animals are different. The south of Brazil is cold. The climate is similar to the climate of Europe. So the animals that grow in that climate are more adequate to the consumers of Europe. So there's a technical agronomical issue there that needs to be considered. Anyways, so here we are. The south part of Brazil, where eventually some good guys are there, they are producing well. They're not chopping down the Amazon because they are 3,000 kilometers away from the Amazon. And here they are punished because a few colleagues of theirs are burning the forest in the Amazon, and they are, right? There are ranchers burning the forest in the Amazon. But eventually those guys are contaminating the good exports of the good guys down south. So when they receive the message of a boycott of investors, of clients of theirs abroad, what are they going to do? They're going to sell to the domestic market, which has a lower bar, which is less demanding, or they will channel their export to China, which is also less demanding. So here we are. We lost a AAA client, or a AAA investor, which could drive those companies in the right direction. And here we are, we're having these AAA partners being replaced by, maybe less than 1-star clients and investors. So, and that's why I said it's very important for us to, first of all, understand the dynamics of the deforestation, separate the good from the bad guys before we take decisions to boycott, to cancel investors, to divest, etc., etc., etc. Once again, Emine, don't take me wrong here. I'm not criticizing. This is a Storebrand I respect. I have good Norwegian friends. I work in Mato Grosso, where Denofa is producing soybean to export to Norway, among others, and so on. So I know very well the system. But I have to say that, for creating a situation is important to highlight a boycott or a divestment, but really to come up with a solution is important to say, in addition to what you are not going to do, it's important to say what you are going to do, which are the guys that you are going to invest, to separate the good from the bad guys. And as I said, most of the guys are good guys. And some of the bad guys are willing to become good guys, and we need to simulate that. Otherwise, the other way is going to happen. The good guys will be transformed into bad guys, and then we lost the war, and the problem remains.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. So I guess that takes us quite nicely onto some of the dynamics that we've come up in the engagement. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forests, which is about 40 investors trying to engage with companies across the cattle and soybean value chains, and a large part has focused on the meat processors. And yeah, I think it really highlights to the fact that you've touched on there, Andre, is that ultimately this requires an industry level approach. We see that the evidence suggests that the majority of deforestation in both the Amazon and Cerrado is illegal, and also that this is being done by a small number of actors moving into undesignated forests or clearing land without authorization. And this ultimately is ending up in agribusiness supply chains, whether they can control it or not at the moment. And that obviously represents a risk for them. And so in terms of trying to sell, as Emine said, to clients overseas or even domestically, that is a risk from a reputational point of view, and also with these incoming due diligence requirements as well. And so I think that is where a lot of the engagement has focused on with that section of the supply chain, and maybe Daniela and Emine, you could touch on some of the kind of key asks that have been kind of portrayed to companies by investors in their engagement, specifically with the meat processors, and I suppose the importance of those asks as well.
Yeah. So I was just trying to play the bad guy, Andre. We are in dialogue with many of the meat packers, and I also want to underline, this is a very important point to make. It's we need to also differ between the upstream companies and downstream companies. So although the deforestation is closer, it's easier to identify as upstream companies. The upstream companies needs to be publicly listed for us to be invested in. Many of the companies that are in Brazil might not be investable for us. They need to be quite big in size. So, I just want to make that distinction clear as well. So we're most likely not able to invest in many of the good guys as well. So we are working together with Robeco and other investors under the PRI umbrella. We are in dialogue with the main meat packers and the soy traders, and I always center the discussion around three main topics. First of all, we want them to have a publicly disclosed commodity-specific policy, and we see that many companies have this in place. Since the New York Declaration in 2014, that there has been a progress at the policy level. The problem is there's an implementation gap. So the main issue that we've been focusing on with the meat packers is traceability in indirect supply chain. And how can we solve this issue? And I think what Tom said is extremely important. For us in Storebrand, we want to have a proactive approach and not a reactive approach. We don't want to wait until the incident happened, and we want to seek for industry level solutions. And I'm happy to hear some advice from Andre what that can be. We have been pushing for, the GTA data, the car data, and then we have the VisiPEC tool. There are so many tools and solutions, and investors are not experts in this field. And then for the soy traders, the issue has been very different because our focus is not only the Amazon, it's the Cerrado, it's Pantanal, it might be other natural vegetation that are important to biodiversity. Although in many of the publications, it seems like we only focus on the Amazon, that's not the case. So the Cerrado is, of course, very important, and the forest code applies in a different way there. And there, the problem is illegal versus legal deforestation. And we have tried to push the traders, Abiovi, to have this biome level solution, which, has not been very easy for us. So this is what we want to, we're looking for, as you said, innovative private sector solutions and working with companies on this. So and we're very happy that we can be working together with other colleagues in PRI in a systematic manner, and also them providing technical guidance to investors on this issue.
Yeah, and I'd add to some of the points that Emine said there. So in terms of, I suppose, the voluntary commitments from the soy side of things, we've seen the Amazon soy moratorium in 2006 signed by a number of the large commodities traders. And as you mentioned there, the forest code, which is less stringent in the Cerrado biome, and that is where a lot of the engagement dialogue has been in terms of trying to encourage commodities traders to set a cutoff date after which they no longer source commodities either from land that is cleared any native vegetation, whether illegal or legal. And so that has been the main focus. And then also on the meat processes, Emine touched on there, the GTA and car data. So this is really about some of the technical aspects of indirect traceability and ensuring that the meat processors can provide assurances to their clients that the products that they sell, the beef, the leather, is deforestation free, which unless they can fully trace the source of that through the different farms that cattle is produced on through its life cycle, it's very difficult for them to be able to do that. And so that has really been the main ask for for the meat processors as well. And Daniela, I mean, you also touched on your engagement earlier with the meat processors and also the commodities traders. I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to add. I know Robeco have been very actively involved in the investor initiative for sustainable forests.
Well, I think that aside from the meat packers, I mean, we have been trying to talk to them. It is a challenge, but I want to highlight the timber and pulp and paper industry. The pulp and paper industry is huge in Brazil. They are forest owners. They are close to traditional communities, so they interact with those communities. We are in a challenge with this industry in terms of a forest certification, because they're always grabbing more forest and then they preserve well. But then if you look into the forest certification, it's never 100%. And then, there you have a clear risk of deforestation. It's not as big and latent as in the meat packing industry, but that's a source of engagement for us. And then in terms of the trading companies, we opted not only to engage with the trading companies, but with consumer companies as well. Okay, so companies of consumer goods that use palm oil, soy product based, but also retailers. Why retailers? Well, first you have a big initiative, which is the Retail Soy Group in Europe, with a lot of retailers that want to source more sustainably. So we already have companies engaged in that, and we think it's important to work together with them. But then second is because, as Emine said, some of those companies, they're too small for us. They're not listed. So that's the way to impact. So you go then to their consuming markets. So if you go to the food companies, if you go to the retailers and said, look, we're not going to invest in your companies if you don't have a sustainability policy for product supply, sometimes it generates slightly more impact than going through the companies. So those are initiatives we are trying to do as well.
Perfect, and that's a really good point as well. I mean, obviously touched on some of the key producers of the commodities, and those, I guess, directly exposed to deforestation will be private, family run, and most institutional investors will not be exposed to them. But obviously, you have the commodities traders and the other meat processors, as well as a huge number of downstream companies who are sourcing these commodities. So I think investors looking across their portfolios at which companies are going to be exposed really needs to have quite a wide number of companies, wide universe of companies that could potentially be involved. And each of those obviously have different leverage through the supply chain to be able to address this, what is ultimately a very complicated issue on the ground. And I think that leads quite nicely onto the question, or the next question for you, Emine, is around engagement with the government. So there's obviously a number of policies that the government can put in place that will help to address this issue. And Storebrand have obviously been involved, if not leading, the efforts by a number of investors to engage with the Brazilian government on this. So yeah, it would be excellent if you could provide an overview of that engagement to date.
Yeah, so this is a quite different engagement, because usually we engage with companies and not with governments. So this is a new type of engagement. And Storebrand and Blue Bay Asset Management in the UK, we're leading a global initiative called IPDD, Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. And currently we have 43 global investors, mostly in Europe, but also in Asia, in US, and also in Brazil, representing $6 trillion. And the aim of the initiative is to coordinate a public policy dialogue on halting deforestation. Our work started in Brazil, but it's not fair to single out Brazil, and it will expand to other countries where deforestation is relevant. So I just want to make that clear. We have committed to work over 2 years together as investors. The initiative started with an open letter to the Brazilian embassy in Norway. And eventually, the investor community showed a great interest to this conversation. So there were 30 investors sending letters to several embassies in different countries across Europe, US, and Japan. In our letter, we urged the government of Brazil to demonstrate clear commitment to halting deforestation and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. We explained that deforestation may have financial impact on our investee companies and our clients. And we also recognize that Brazil, as Andre said, has good record of combating deforestation while at the same time providing favorable conditions for investments. We never talked about divestment. This was never our entry point. We said we want to invest more in Brazil. And for us who have been working for this for a very long time, like Robeco and Storebrand, I think it became evident that we need everyone to pull in the right direction. We need investors, government, and companies to move in the same direction. We can only play our role in a sustainable economy if the government is providing that regulatory framework, if they provide the right condition for the sustainable companies that we're invested in. So it is fair to say that we were not sure what the feedback would be. We expected maybe a meeting with the embassy in Norway. Within a few days, we had the governor of the central bank in Brazil calling us, trying to understand our concerns. He set up a meeting with the Amazon Council, with Vice President Mourão and several ministers, the Minister of Environment, Agriculture, Foreign Affairs. And the meeting were very polite. They made some promises, and from our side, we had 5 concrete outcomes. We wanted to see data that shows that deforestation is halting. Right after our meeting, Bolsonaro announced a 120-day Amazon fire ban. Our meeting followed up with a meeting with the president of the Congress, Rodrigo Maia. This was a very crucial meeting. He has been a central figure in ensuring that the system of check and balances are in place, and that the legislative is able to block some of the more controversial laws that the government is suggesting. And Maia was very understanding. I think he publicly went out and said that the Congress will not vote on any controversial matters related to the environment that may damage Brazil's image abroad. So I think I'm just aware and conscious of our time. I think going forward, we will continue our dialogue with the Brazilian authorities, but also other countries. And I don't know if that covered what you wanted, Tom.
Yeah, no, that's very useful. I think for those listening in, just to understand how this dialogue has kind of come about and what the aims are. Daniela, I'd also bring you in as well, just to hear from Robeco, because obviously Robeco are also involved. Some of the rationale behind why you thought it was appropriate to start engaging the government on this issue.
Well, we have a big top-down emerging markets strategy. I think it's one of the most well-known European top-down approach. We think that deforestation is a top-down risk for emerging markets. Okay, and the risk has been increasing in the past 10 years, the way Andre brilliantly explained. So from that perspective, we see that the deforestation issue in Brazil became a macro problem, the same way it is for some other Southern Asian countries, for instance. Okay, that's one. On the stewardship side, we think that it complements the engagement with companies. So we have been engaging with companies already for some time in the team. It's one of the key themes for Robeco, but we think that it's complementary. The point I wanted to make here is that it has been key the coordination of investors and working as a group. And then we were gladly working together with Storebrand and Blue Bay on this, because what we believe is that stronger we are together. What is nice about our group is that you have equity, fixed income, or even investors that have a more private equity approach. They're all in the group. But then the interest is the same, is to see clear improvements, because there is an investment opportunity here, and we just want to do it on a proper way, in a sustainable way.
Excellent. And I think, yeah, from my perspective, great about the IPDD is that it has very clear goals that they like to achieve, and that's obviously important in all aspects of engagement, and particularly with governments. And I think also within the PRI's general views of stewardship, we see it evolving, is that investors are looking more towards an outcomes focus in their engagement. So looking at deforestation as an issue, understanding, as Andre and has been touched on here, the different drivers of deforestation, and the fact that this isn't something that is necessarily just solved by companies or one actor or the other or somewhere in the supply chain. The risks will really still be present until deforestation is addressed, particularly as a systemic risk, which is where you need this more holistic view of engagement on outcomes with both policymakers, either as investors in companies in Brazil or as bondholders of the Brazilian sovereign debt, or alternatively engagement with companies that is kind of commonplace on ESG issues more widely. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left. I think it would be a real shame if we didn't touch on some of the other really important aspects of the links of deforestation in Brazil and the risks for investors, and that is really about indigenous rights. And so maybe, Andre, it'd be excellent from your perspective on the ground to understand a little bit more about the interplay between deforestation, indigenous rights, and I suppose also in the light of the COVID-19 crisis as well.
Well, we will need another full section for that, but let me see what I can do in a couple of minutes, Tom. Well, the indigenous territories, they protect about 1/3 of the Amazon. So it's important to put it in perspective. So we're talking about 600,000 indigenous peoples, representing more than 160 different ethnies and more than 200 languages. So it's extremely rich. But most importantly, they do protect 30% of the Amazon. So, to cut a long story short, Tom, in an ideal world, farmers and ranchers in the Cerrado, consumers in Europe, should be the best friends of the indigenous groups, protecting the main asset that they need and they get for free, which is water. So, and why is not happening? Why is that not happening? I think we have, as we've seen throughout the discussion today, we have all the elements. We have goodwill from investors. We have commitment from clients, from consumers. We have, an engaged society. We have technology available. We have investors willing to invest. I mean, all the ingredients are there. What we don't have in Brazil today is political will. That's the problem we have in Brazil today. As Emine has said, you've been meeting with the authorities in Brazil. I've been meeting with authorities in Brazil, and the rhetoric is nice. They say, yeah, we see there's a problem, etc. But in the next day, the deforestation continues to climb. The forest fires continue to increase. So there is a disconnection there between the governmental rhetoric and what we're observing on the ground. As I said before, deforestation this year is going to climb somewhere between 20 and 30%. Some would say that it will go over 40% compared to last year. So that's a lack of political will. As I said before, a few guys are making a mess in the Amazon. Those are criminals. Those are not farmers and ranchers. Those are criminals. They have to be arrested, go to jail. We have laws for that. But the administration is not going in that direction. So we'll have to wait, probably. And that's pretty much what I can say, for another 2 years for the election to change the political willingness.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andre. And so I think that's a great final remark from you, in that this is about kind of enforcement of existing policy. And that's what I think investors want to see across the board, and also companies as well. Maybe quickly, Daniela and Emine, maybe Emine first, to give a quick closing remark for the audience and takeaways?
No, I just wanted to highlight what Andrea said on indigenous peoples, because we focus so much on climate and biodiversity, but it's so important to also keep the rights of indigenous peoples in focus when in our dialogue with companies and government, because not only are they it's their home, but it's also we know that research is showing that when indigenous peoples are protected and have full property rights, they are the best guardians of the forest. So we need to also have that in mind when talking with companies and also with the government.
Great. And maybe over to you, Daniela, just for a quick closing remark.
Okay, so yeah, our point is we are investors in Brazil since a very long time. Our strategy goes back to the 30s, investing in emerging markets. We want to continue to invest. We do have concerns that deforestation can implicate in a higher cost of financing for the country. It's a country that needs to grow, that has an enormous potential in its agribusiness, and it would be a shame if it doesn't get enough financing because it's not following the proper sustainable practices. I think there is space for that. The country has a history of good environmental policies. I think we just need to go back to rationality and go back to that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So thanks again to Daniela, Andre, and Emine. I think it's been a great session. I think we've covered quite a lot in a very short space of time, and I wish we had a little bit longer to unpack a few things. But yeah, thank you all to the audience as well for joining us. And I think in this case, you will be able to rejoin the mainstream shortly. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and yeah, goodbye.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you,
Thank
PRI.
you, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.